Okay, so I just got back from the ironing board and I fused my inner facings to the wrong side of my fashion fabric for my facings. And what I now need to do is I need to make sure that I have identified the color, or not the color, but the shoulder seam here. And what we have here is we have 2 notches. And so what I did was I just gently clipped into the shoulder seam there. On both pieces, there's a double notch on this side along the shoulder seam, so that when I remove my pattern pieces, I'll know which end of these facings actually need to be attached. So I'm going to just line up my double notches with right sides together. As you can see, I have my notch on one end and my notch on the other end. And I just want to line up those notches there as best that I can. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and put a couple pins in to keep that line straight. And according to my pattern, I should sew this shoulder seam at 5/8 of an inch. Now, what I see when I flip this over is I have a little bit of edging that's kind of sticking out here. And so this was probably just an error that I had when I was cutting. So I'm just going to go ahead and snip off that edge to make sure that everything's matching up. And I'm going to go ahead and slide this under my presser foot. And I'm going to stitch this just a regular stitch length, about 2.5, with this raw edge of the seam that I'm going to close at 5/8 of an inch. I'm going to do a back tack at the front and end of the seam. And again, just making sure that this raw edge over here is running right along the 5/8 inch markings. And I'm going to do a back tack real quick there. Go ahead and raise my needle and presser foot up and trim my thread tails. Okay. Then what I need to do is I just need to open this up and go ahead and press these seam allowances open. And I'm just going to do a finger press here. If you want to run over to the ironing board to go ahead and press this open, that might be a good idea. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to keep that open, and I'm going to put a couple pins in just here on the edge, so it just keeps that seam allowance flat. Because what I now need to do is I need to do some sort of edge finish right along the outside edge. And my favorite one is the Stitch in Pink, because I feel like it's easy and fast. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start along this outer edge here, the long outside curve, and I'm just going to put a row of stitching in, and I'm going to run that raw edge right along the outside of my presser foot. And I'm doing this with the interfacing on the top side, so that when I approach this seam allowance here that has been pressed open, that I can make sure that it doesn't get caught and pushed towards the middle, that everything lays as flat as possible. I don't have to worry about doing any back tacking when doing this, because these will all eventually, like, ideally get put into a type of seam. But it's very important that we do this step and do a type of edge finish on this outer edge, because we're not sewing anything to it. If you ever don't sew something to another piece of fabric, you should do some sort of edge finish, because otherwise your fabric will ravel, and you could just have all sorts of other problems with you know, seams possibly coming undone, or just like the actual yarns that hold that fabric together, they could just become loose because they're not attached to anything. So it's always a good practice that if we are not sewing an edge into something, that we do some sort of edge finish. So I've done that stitch there, and I got some pinking shears for home. And I'm just going to come back right along that edge and use my pinking shears and pink that edge off to do my edge finish. It's a little thick right where that seam came together, so where all those extra layers are. And I have that all completed, and I can just toss that little edge of something right into the trash. And I can go ahead and remove my pins, and this is my facing piece that I'll use. So this the facing unit is now constructed, and so I can set that off to the side to go on and do the next step. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and move to my bodice pieces, and I'm going to join and seam the shoulder seams here. So I'm going to go ahead and remove my pins, set my patterns to the side, making sure that when I looked at those, I'm like, oh, now what was that seam allowance for the shoulder? And it's 5/8, so I'm going to just layer my top, my front bodice on top of my back bodice, lining up the raw edges of the shoulder seam here, making sure that one's not overlapping the other. I want to make sure that these are flush along the edge here, and then I'm going to put a couple pins in just to keep everything straight. And I'm going to start at the end part of the neckline and then sew to the shoulder, or to where the arm's going to meet. And I'm going to line up this raw edge here right at 5/8 again. And I'm going to do a back tack at the front and end of this seam. Alright, when I'm done with that, I can raise up my needle and presser foot and trim those thread tails. Alright. Now the next step that I'll need to do is I need to press this seam open. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and do a good finger press on that and set it aside, because I'm going to be going to the iron again here in a moment, and I'm just going to make one trip and kind of press everything all at once. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to move on to my collar piece. So let's look at our collar pattern real quick. And what we can see is we have a center back lined up here, and this is all one unit, and this notch right here is where we're actually going to be lining up with the shoulder seam that we just sewed on the bodice. So we have two layers. One is going to be our top collar, and the other one is going to be our under collar. So we have an upper collar and an under collar for pretty much every collar that we make. And when we have the upper collar and under collar, we want to lay this out just exactly as it's going to come together. And so, my upper collar is going to be on top, and then my under collar is going to be on the bottom. Just as it is right here. And when you apply your interfacing, and I've gone ahead and fused mine, you want to fuse it to the under collar portion. And you know which one that you need to do by actually physically laying this collar out on top of the bodice that you've just created. So here we have our front collar here, the front of our neckline, which scoops down, and then the back part is a lot more straight. And so when we lay this out, this curved part matches the curved part of our collar, and then it's going to wrap around to the back. Okay, so make sure that when you to make sure that when you're choosing your upper collar and your under collar, that you physically lay it out how it's going to be finished, and then we have to take a step backwards to make sure that we have all of our edges enclosed and there's nothing that's open to the wild. So now that we've identified which is our upper and under collar, make sure that you go ahead and fuse that interfacing to the under collar, and then you can set your bodice aside, and then we just need to flip this. Once your interfacing has been established and been applied to your under collar, then what we want to do is we want to layer both pieces. So this is my one piece, and I'm going to layer my other one with right sides together, just on top of each other. And I'm going to be stitching around this outer edge from end to end here. Alright, so what I want to do is I want to make sure that I have all my outer edges lined up. So I'm going to go ahead and just line up those raw edges as best I can and put some pins in all the way around the outside. Okay, and we also want to just, also put a row of pins to hold down this center back seam, because on the Peter Pan collar, it is typically applied to a bodice that has an open, a center back opening. and the collar itself is not sewn into the center back opening, it sits on top of it. And I know it's a little difficult to kind of understand at this point, but when we're finished you'll probably see what I mean. So just kind of bear with me, and what we're going to do is we're going to stitch all the way, we're going to start at kind of the curved point up here, we're going to stitch all the way around the outside at 1/4 inch, then we're finished there, and then we're going to come back and do a 5/8 inch closure around the top here. So I'm going to start here, and according to my pattern I have a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around the outside. So just make sure that you, and try your best to keep this raw edge lined up with a 1/4 inch, and if you need to, it might be a good idea to you know, just lightly sketch a 1/4 inch all the way around if you need. Take the time to save some time. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start, and I am going to do a back stitch real quick at the front and end of this. And just another thing is, like, if you line up this raw edge with the outside of your presser foot, that's about a 1/4 inch to the center of your needle that's going in and out of your fabric. So if you don't want to take some time to go ahead and measure that, that's always a good eyeball or a good guideline to follow. And when you get to those pins, make sure that you stop. And these curves are fairly tight, so if at any point you feel like you just need to adjust your fabric, keep your needle in the down position, raise up your presser foot, and just slightly move it over. Because you might have to do that a couple times just because this corner is fairly tight. And again, I'm just keeping that raw edge lined up right with the outside edge of my presser foot, because that's at about a 1/4 inch seam allowance marking here. Alright, now when I get to the end point here, I'm just going to continue to kind of run it off the edge, and I'm going to do a little back stitch and raise up my needle and presser foot and trim that tail. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back in from the bottom and sew up along this this straight edge that I have at 5/8, because that's what my pattern shows to do. So I'm going to go ahead and lower my needle in and do another back tack and stitch line, this time at 5/8 inch seam allowance. And do a back tack on this. Alright. Now what we need to do is we need to do a little trimming. Even though it's only a 1/4 inch seam allowance, it's still quite a bit. So I'm going to start at the back where there's been that 5/8, and I'm going to go ahead and trim that down to a little over 1/8 possibly. And then I'm going to come back, and you do a process of trimming that it's whenever you're removing this excess bulk from a seam. It's usually in the order of trim, grade, clip, notch. Okay, trim, grade, clip, notch. Hopefully that when you leave this class you'll go away with when I need to remove bulk in a seam, what order should I do things in? It is trim, grade, clip, notch. Alright, so if our seam was a little bit bigger here, we would trim it down to about a 1/4 inch, but since that's what we sewed it at, just make sure that these edges are level. So I'm going to come back in, and I'm just going to take off just like a sliver to make sure that my raw edges are level around the outside. My scissors are kind of squeaky. Hopefully they're not too distracting in the video. Okay. Remove that. Alright, so we trimmed it, and trimming is when we do our cutting and removing of excess bulk so that the multiple layers are at the same length. Then I'm going to come back in and I'm going to grade. And to grade something means that you trim at uneven layers for your at uneven heights for your multiple layers that have been into a seam. So I'm going to go ahead and come in here, and I'm just going to take this down to about half width, which isn't very much. Oh, I think I was just cutting on the interfacing. I need to make sure I cut through the interfacing and the facing piece. I'm just going to trim this all the way around the edge. Oops. Alright, so as you can see, this outer edge is now one edge is longer, and then I have graded that, and then I'm going to come in and I'm just going to do small little clips all around this edge because it's curved. Just make sure that when you clip, you don't accidentally snip through your stitch line. I kind of got a little close on that last one. And when I get to this, this outer edge here, what I actually want to do is I want to go ahead and notch out some fabric, because when I go to turn this, there's going to be, this fabric is going to want to fold over into itself, and so we just need to create a space for this fabric to go and to move. So I'm going to go ahead and notch out some areas there, which are just taking small little triangles out. Then I'm going to go back to clipping. Wonderful. Then what I want to do is I want to turn this collar inside out. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it inside out and just try to press those seams, like with my fingers, kind of roll them back and forth to try to get that seam to be as smooth as I can all the way around the edge. Alright. Now typically what we would do is we would want to come back in and do a row of understitching to attach our seam allowance to our facing piece, which is our interfaced side of the interface side of the undercollar. But our collar is fairly small, so I think what we should do is we should first press it, see what the situation is. Maybe it will press out a little bit more. So I've kind of turned that around here, and I can see that right there in my corner, it's not kicking out quite the shape that I need. So I'm going to take my scissors, be very gentle, and just press that corner out to try to get that to be as sharp as you can. It looks like there's a little bit more bulk in there than I'd want. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it back out, and I'm just going to clip that little triangle off the top. Make sure that you don't actually cut through where your stitchings cross over, but we want to just try to get that point, or remove as much bulk as we can to get that to come to a point. There's a little square on the end, but it's not too bad. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and stop the video, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to press my facing unit, press that seam allowance there. I'm also going to press open my shoulder seam of my bodice, and then I'm going to press my collar, and when I press this, I want to try to press it flat and make sure that this the interface side of the undercollar doesn't want to accidentally roll to the front. So make sure that when you press that, we try to keep the seam as flat as possible, and we don't have any of this undercollar kind of creep into the front. So I'm going to press, then we'll come back and kind of assemble all of this.